All right, up on the Colgate Hill, that's the Hamilton Hospital that you'll go to when you overdose on edibles. But this week, it's not about marijuana, it's about stimulants. Illicit stimulants. Uppers and downers is the next section of the course that we'll be talking about. And this kind of begins the last half of the class, where every week we'll examine one of those categories of drugs, the podcast categories that we learned about in chapter 5. But in this next week, we're going to look at the Aston podcast stimulants as I bike my way up the hill. Okay, here we go. So stimulants is the next topic, and I'm going to kind of restrict our look into stimulants this week into the illicit stimulants, particularly cocaine and amphetamines. There's another classic stimulant, and that is, of course, caffeine. But we're going to spend a whole chapter on that a little later on when we get to the familiar drugs. Caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, nicotine to some extent. No, we're not going to look at that chapter. And we'll also take a look at the non-illicit stimulants, such as Adderall and Ritalin, often used for psychotherapeutic purposes, particularly to address the problems of ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. All right, I gotta pay attention here. Here we go. All right, made it. All right, it's a beautiful day out here at Colgate. We are experiencing abnormally warm temperatures. Beautiful day! And yeah, hit those cups. Eh?
Having a good time?
Oh, of course. How can I not be?
There you go. Take care, man. Go on.
Oh, Colgate students. Yep. Carefree. They'll learn. Or they won't. So, I'm going to take a look at cocaine first. The restricted stimulant, of course. It's on Schedule 2 of the Schedules of Control, made important by the Comprehensive Drug and Controlled Substances Act of 1970. Schedule 2 indicates high potential for abuse, certainly some danger in the safety and risk of the drug, but also some medical use. We'll get to that later. Cocaine has been around, like most drugs, for a long, long time. It grows naturally in South America, Central South America, the countries of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Uruguay, and typically on the slopes of the Andes and associated mountain ranges. And its use goes way back in history to the Inca natives, who were known through the artifacts that were left behind by the Inca to have used cocaine as a stimulant, but not in the same way that you might be thinking of. I got snowy back here. The leaves of the coca bush contain the main ingredient that becomes the cocaine that we're more familiar with, which might be a white powdery substance. But the Inca were using the coca leaf orally. They would chew the coca leaves and get a little lift. Nothing like the cocaine high of a snorting powder cocaine or smoking crack, but certainly a lift, probably not unlike tea or coffee, probably more like coffee. And this is a well-known ceremonial drug in the Incan culture, used in religious ceremonies and by the shaman. And interestingly, it was also valuable enough that it was used as currency. The leaves themselves were a form of Incan money. So how did it arrive in the West, so to speak? Cocaine arrives in the West sometime prior to the 1800s. Certainly a result of exploration and the movement of people around the world and colonization as well. It comes to the West and is analyzed, of course, chemically, and discovered to be able to be extracted from the leaf, the active ingredient, cocaine, extracted from the leaf of the bush, the plant, and it is around 1865 to 1900 or so that it starts to be used in all sorts of products, these so-called patent medicines that we learned about in chapter 3. Lozenges for the throat, wines. There's a famous wine called Mariani. Mariani, after the inventor Angelo Mariani, who mixed the cocaine extract with wine. And perhaps, of course, the most famous coca product, Coca-Cola, did in fact have cocaine extract in it as the busy lifting element. That drink early in its creation. I think it was 1912, perhaps 1914, as the new laws emerged, controlling, again, through taxation, not through direct illegality, but through regulation and taxation. The 1914 Harrison Act was perhaps the most important law, federal law, controlling or attempting to control cocaine. Interesting fact, by the year 1900, Americans could walk into any pharmacy and purchase a gram of pure cocaine for a mere 25 cents. It was among the country's 5 best-selling pharmaceuticals in that year, 1900. But yes, people were getting perhaps a little bit to be dependent on those drugs, particularly cocaine, and it was controlled after the 1914 Harrison Act. In terms of cocaine's medical history, it is well known as a local anesthesia, numbing the areas of the body that it is in contact with, not putting one to sleep, but creating that numbness in the affected areas. And its active ingredient is discovered by 1860 by a doctor named H.W. Halsted. Once the active ingredient is discovered, its extraction is what is responsible for the existence of powder cocaine. Essentially, the leaves are crushed and macerated to the point where a kind of white liquidy paste comes out. That's called coca paste. And then when that is dried and then broken up, it turns into that powder cocaine that we're familiar with today. And it takes the processing of about 1,000 pounds of coca leaves to produce 2 pounds of raw cocaine powder. Early physicians that use cocaine in practice, among them are Sigmund Freud, the famous or perhaps infamous early psychologist and inventor of psychotherapy. Cocaine is used by Freud to treat depression as well as dependence on morphine, which of course is that form of opium that we use still today in medicine. Later, after becoming dependent on cocaine himself, Freud makes the argument that cocaine is not a safe drug and can lead to a condition called cocaine psychosis. He had to nurse a friend through the sort of psychotic state induced by using cocaine. So pretty early on it's recognized that its utility for psychotherapy or psychological treatment is probably not indicated by virtue of the fact that it's quite dangerous and unsafe, both physically and psychologically. Contemporary use of medical cocaine is restricted to dental surgery and esophageal or throat surgery. So ENTs, ear, nose, and throat doctors, may use cocaine still as a numbing agent in those types of surgeries, local numbing agent. So yes, contemporary control of cocaine, legal control begins with the 1970s Controlled Substances Act, and at that point in time, the only form of cocaine that was typically used in recreational use was cocaine hydrochloride. And that's the powder cocaine I've been talking about, extracted from the coca leaf. And that changes somewhat in the 1980s. By the 1980s, the legal controls on crack cocaine begin in 1986 as the war on as the war on drugs ramps up in the Reagan era, a much more conservative political era, and one in which drugs are used, as in the Nixon era, to control, let's just call it undesirable populations that risk the order of the establishment and are not seen as empowered. So this involves the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act and 1988 Act as well. Since that time, of course, concerns have grown about those acts, because what they did is they targeted crack cocaine particularly, which they saw as the drug du jour, as we called it in chapter 1, the drug that perhaps is seen to be the most risky drug of the day. And certainly it was not doing good things to communities, particularly poor communities, where the rock cocaine could be sold at a much lower price because of the form it's in, that rock form, than powder cocaine. And so that law creates a situation where crack cocaine is being penalized at a much more aggressive rate than powder cocaine. The penalties in some cases were 100-to-1 difference, whereas somebody caught with powder cocaine might be in trouble. Somebody caught with an equivalent amount of crack cocaine would be in 100 times more trouble in terms of sentencing and penalties. So given that the crack cocaine was being targeted in communities of color particularly, and other impoverished communities, those penalties today are seen to be remarkably racist and really instigated a whole new form of institutionalized racism that is talked about quite eloquently by a sociologist from the University of Ohio. Her name is Michelle Alexander, and in the late 1990s she wrote a book talking about that use of penalties to control black populations at the time. She calls it a new Jim Crow, the whole new era whereby the law discriminates unfairly against black populations in America. Unfortunately, those laws still influence us today. The difference has been cut back in terms of the penalties, but crack cocaine is still punished at an 18-to-1 ratio in terms of fines and penalties and jail time compared to cocaine hydrochloride or powder cocaine, which in the 1980s and up till today is primarily a drug of the business class and the celebrity class and the rich, to be honest, because it is far more expensive to buy a bag of cocaine, certainly not the 25 cents you'd pay at the pharmacy in the year 1900, than it is to buy crack cocaine. So those injustices remain today, perhaps not quite as severe, but it is still a form of racial injustice in America, the penalties against cocaine. Looking at the forms of cocaine, we have essentially four forms, and they are cocaine hydrochloride, as I mentioned. That is the breakdown of the coca paste that can be made by grinding up the leaves and drying the liquidy paste that comes out of those. There's the crack cocaine, which again involves mixing the powder cocaine with a base, typically baking soda. Add water, baking soda, and powder cocaine, and that will crystallize into crack. And that also solidifies the base, solidifies the salt, hydrochloride, so that it won't break down when ignited, and thus can be inhaled and taken into the lungs as a route of administration. Powder cocaine, if you try to put it in a pipe and smoke it, you're going to waste it. It will burn up the active ingredient that will get you high before it reaches your lungs. And so that's why people don't smoke powder cocaine. You have to add that base to it first in order to crystallize the hydrochloride chemical. There's also a way to break the base chain and turn it into a liquid. This is called freebasing, and this is where you can inject cocaine by liquefying it and removing the base. It's the least familiar format of cocaine use to me, so I'm not exactly sure how that works, but freebasing is certainly one other option for routes of administration. So just to review that, you can snort it, which is topical route of administration. You can smoke or inhale crack cocaine, and that of course is inhalation as a route of administration, and you can inject liquefied freebased cocaine so that it immediately goes into the veins and into the bloodstream. In terms of what it's doing medically in your brain and body, in terms of the nervous system and neurotransmission, it is blocking reuptake of dopamine. It's pretty well understood that cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine in the brain, and that means, if you recall the life cycle of the neurotransmitter, that more of the dopamine neurotransmitters are going to remain in the synapse to be absorbed and bound into the dendrites of an adjacent neuron, and therefore trigger that neuron to excite. And so that's where it gets its excitatory properties. Didn't make that turn. Cocaine is deactivated in the body by enzymes in the blood and liver. The liver, of course, being a very important organ in deactivating all drugs. But the metabolites last about 8 hours, and the effects, that doesn't mean that you get high for 8 hours, but the effects typically last for snorted cocaine approximately 2 hours, 1 to 2 hours. For inhaled crack or injected cocaine, typically less than that, 20 to 30 minutes perhaps. The acute physical toxic effects of cocaine, other than of course the excitation or stimulation, involves increase in heart rate, increase of dilation of the blood vessels, dilation of the pupils, and a general excitation of what we call the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, all those functions of your body that are involuntary and are involved in the fight or flight response of the body. There is the potential for overdose, certainly. Many of our famous celebrities have died. The famous Saturday Night Live original cast member John Belushi died of cocaine overdose in the early 1980s, I believe, maybe late 1970s. Famous star of Animal House, classic college movie. And that is a clear risk of safety of cocaine use. Chronic toxicity involves damage to the nasal septum if it's snorted regularly. Again, the sign of that is a bleeding nose, frequent bleeding nose, and as well as damage to the heart muscle. And there is the risk of paranoid psychosis, which is what Freud discovered early on in his use of cocaine. Dependence does occur in some users at about the same rate as other dependence-forming drugs like heroin or nicotine. And those dependencies, of course, can lead to increased use, increased tolerance, and a higher risk of death as a result of overdose. Other causes of concern involve cocaine use during pregnancy, where there's an increased risk of miscarriage and torn placenta. Long-term effects of prenatal cocaine are really still under study, but certainly not something you'd want to be involved in if you're pregnant. In terms of the social aspects of cocaine, it is still a drug that is commonly traded from South America through Mexico into the United States. There have been in the past military interdictions in Colombia particularly to try to eradicate the cocaine bush fields, and that has had limited or no success in eliminating the drug from the population. It's also a major trade item in the black market of the Mexican drug cartels. So that does lead to greater violence and international border difficulties and disputes. Here we go, going down. Oh. Whew. Whee! Oh, ouch. That hurt. Let go of my pedal. On. Amphetamines initially derive from the active ingredient in a plant called ma huang, a Chinese plant that was frequently used for herbal medicines. And that goes back many, many centuries in its use. That main ingredient, ephedra, is also known as ephedrine, is a sympathomimetic drug, which means it copies the actions of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, similar to cocaine. In 1932, this drug, ephedrine, was able to be examined and synthesized in a laboratory in the form of what was called benzedrine. From that point forward, amphetamines were a new class of drug specific to the drug classification category of stimulants. That new drug, benzedrine, and the amphetamines that came after it were initially medically used. They were used for conditions like asthma, narcolepsy, a sleep condition, hyperactivity in children, which of course stimulants are still used to that effect, and as a generalized stimulant. In the 20th century, after its invention or synthesis, it was used pretty heavily in World War II as a stimulant for soldiers. There were certainly amphetamine dependent soldiers coming off of that war. And then its use as a recreational drug truly began in the 1960s, particularly in the West Coast in California and San Francisco primarily. There was a whole scene called the speed scene, and this is where it got its nickname Speed. And of course, at the end of the 1960s, there was that new Controlled Substances Act of 1970, so amphetamines were clearly indicated as a result of their recreational use as a drug necessary to be controlled at that time. So tighter controls came with that act, and as a result, new look-alike drugs appeared. That's been happening ever since with amphetamines. Bath salts, for instance, it's simply a new recreational form. Ooh, bouncy here. New recreational form of speed or amphetamines. Slightly different chemical formulas, so it can be used recreationally without risk of legal infringement until, of course, those types of laboratory-based designer drugs are also made illegal. Let's go up here. One of those new designer drugs that emerged in the 1990s was methamphetamine hydrochloride, another salt crystal-based formulation of amphetamines, often just simply called crystal meth. And that drug took off pretty significantly and became a widely used recreational drug because it was not too difficult to make in a laboratory. This is a drug that featured in the famous TV series Breaking Bad, where a high school chemistry teacher who learns he's going to die of cancer soon wants to leave a fortune for his wife and family and turns to making and selling methamphetamine. And the series is just one bad episode after another of him getting involved in the underground trafficking of illegal narcotics. Amphetamines chemically mimic the neurotransmitters ephedrine, norepinephrine, which, if you recall, is related to adrenaline, that hormone, and dopamine. So that gives it that reward sense. By virtue of its chemical formulation, it does cross the blood-brain barrier quite easily, and so is absorbed into the neuron system and glia of the brain without too much trouble. The peak effects last about an hour to an hour and a half, or maybe 5 to 20 minutes after intranasal administration or snorting the crystal powder. The half-life is 5 to 12 hours, so it'll take that long to be metabolized, and like all drugs, is metabolized by enzymes in the blood and liver. Rapid tolerance can develop with the drug, indicating higher and higher levels of use to get the same effect. As those enzymes build up in your blood and liver, the tolerance develops very quickly. Beneficial uses of amphetamines include adjunctive therapy, particularly as a secondary treatment for psychotherapy, and it is indicated in the treatment of ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. But the benefit of amphetamines, because of the tolerance building aspects of it, typically don't last that long, and that's why it's necessary as an adjunctive therapy, not a primary therapy. Amphetamines are also used for weight control. They were as popular in their day in the 1970s as GPT therapy is today. That's Ozempic and the other shots that you get for weight control today. The commonly used drugs for ADHD treatment are Adderall, Concerta, Vyvanse, and Ritalin. And they have an effect on the catecholamine-associated deficits related to ADHD. Whew, running out of breath here. They can be used in high levels to perform better academically, as often college students are using them, and even in athletics, they have been known to be used quite frequently to improve performance. But of course, that use is not okay in the NCAA. So watch out for that drug test. In terms of the effect on performance, it does seem to be effective in the short run, but long-term performance decreases very similar to many drug effects regarding performance. One acute toxic effect has been described colloquially as tweaking. Tweakers are those who have difficulty controlling their hyperactivity while on high doses of amphetamines. Look at the notes there and click on that tweaking video to get an example of what somebody in Walmart looks like when they're tweaking on amphetamines. Chronic toxicity can involve a kind of amphetamine psychosis, not unlike the paranoid psychosis that can come with frequent and high-dose use of cocaine. So again, like cocaine, not the safest of drugs by any stretch. Dependence potential. There does not seem to be that negative reinforcement with amphetamine withdrawal. There's no significant withdrawal effects of stopping amphetamine use, but the positive reinforcement is such that it does lead to some degree to dependence formation in the regular user. All right, running out of battery on my phone here, so I'm gonna have to cut this short. Where am I? 7 o'clock? Yeah. Almost done. So that's cocaine and amphetamines, two restricted drugs that are stimulants, widely used in our society, although not nearly as heavily used as the cannabis and other more familiar drugs, alcohol, of course, and nicotine. So we'll move on next to Chapter 8 in High Price. See you then. Hi, pick it up now with High Price. This week it's Chapter 8, and in Chapter 8, titled Basic Training, Hart discusses his transformation, in a sense, from being a homeboy in Miami to becoming a private first class in the Army, airman first class, I guess. In any case, he goes through basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and discusses the mental challenges that are created for him about his self, about his race, his self-control, and his values. He says he really just had to discover what he wanted in life. A very common experience, I think, for anyone of that age and experiencing the first movement away from family and home and things known. Something I think we can all appreciate. So he goes to Lackland, which is an interesting, actually, moment in my own memory. My brother, 4 years older than I am, in the early 1980s, almost the same time that Carl Hart was writing about, also joined the Air Force after a series of unfortunate circumstances, let's just say. And so he was in the Air Force for, I believe, 2 years, possibly 3, 2.5 maybe, until he was given a discharge for having failed a drug test, the exact same kind of drug test that Carl Hart was worried about failing, and why he decided to take college classes so that he would have some fallback in the event that that did happen. This is almost exactly what happened to my brother many, many years ago, who did end up, after some struggles, going to college, a technical school, getting his degree in computer programming, and now is a senior level programmer at a very large healthcare operation and making bank. So anything can happen. In any case, Hart made friends with two sets in a sense. He said he made friends with the intellectual, his friend Mark, and learned a lot from him about cultural and intellectual things that he had never really experienced when he was a young man in Miami. And he also made friends with he made his stoner friends, he calls them. And it's important to recognize that friendship group was, or his use of drugs, marijuana particularly, in that friendship group was not because he liked marijuana so much. He says earlier in the book that it's not a drug that really turned him on too much. But he did it to achieve the social status that was necessary to belong to the group. And this is often a very strong reinforcer, perhaps a stronger reinforcer than the drug itself, is the social aspect of the drug and how it influences our social interactions. All right, so he goes on in the middle of the chapter to talk about his reason for going to college was that it was a backup in case he got caught by the drug tests. Talks about his influence of music on him. One reason I assign in certain classes a music blog. We can learn a lot from music. Particularly, he talks about this discovery of Bob Marley and reggae music, and as well as jazz and Gil Scott-Heron. So, in any case, finishes the chapter talking about the militarization involved in the war on drugs, connecting the military experience he had with the increasing sense that drugs were something that we needed to go to war on, and in order to go to war, we needed to militarize our police departments. This has been an ongoing endeavor since the 1980s, certainly, and today, the result of that is what we see on the streets of America, more of a military presence in the form of police as opposed to perhaps what might have been more common in the 1970s, much less armed, less heavily armed, less tactical policing. Finally, at the end of the chapter, he discusses his leaves, going home during the leaves in the military, and how he discovers the crack epidemic slowly on his returns, various returns back home, where he has to make some decisions and ultimately decides to go to England and do his the final years of his service there. So let's move on with assignments this week. Pretty light, just one more chapter in the text, chapter 6 on stimulants, and then the online media about that, and the discussion group assignment that you have for this week on stimulants. So check those out, get those in, keep reading in the book. Chapter 9 for next week, and next week we'll do a bi-weekly journal. And if you're writing that paper for SOCIES 370 and you missed an assignment, perhaps, the annotated citations and outline assignment, please do that and get that in as soon as possible. Okay, thank you. See you later. Here's my cat, Leo. Hey, Leo. Oh, there you go. He's a good boy.